Welcome everybody this morning to our Tuesday morning Toolbox Talks. Obviously, we start off with the tips to continually prevent COVID-19. We know that you are probably tired of hearing all these things. We get it. We do understand. We obviously with you with all of this. We just want things to go back to normal again. And what is normal, we don't really know. But the tips to continually prevent COVID-19 could also be called tips to continually increase health and hygiene within the workplace, because washing your hands regularly is obviously a very good thing. If this is not available, water and soap in your area, perhaps having an alcohol-based hand sanitizer with you at all times is also good to get rid of germs. And then avoid touching your eyes, nose, and mouth with unwashed hands. Also, something that is very important for just basic hygiene. Social distancing measures or avoiding close contact with people who are sick is something that we obviously did even before COVID. Covering our cough or sneeze, also something that we did. And then always cleaning or disinfecting things that are regularly touched or frequently touched objects, such as our tools, our vehicles, or anything that we are working with throughout the day. So all these tips, once again, although you might be tired of hearing it, it is still very good. And I think it's something that we should keep continually doing just for good basic hygiene practices. When it comes to vaccination, obviously there are regulations out on vaccinations, companies being able to make it mandatory based on risk assessments, as well as your own personal decision and the requirements around what companies need to do in order to ensure that their staff are vaccinated, and if they are not vaccinated, what they need to do. Now, if you do want more information on that, we do have the free course on the vaccination awareness program. So let us know if we can send that through to you. This morning's Toolbox Talk obviously is the last one for the month on lifting and lowering. And our safety thought obviously for this week would be to lift smart, think, then start. So before we want to do any lifting or lowering, whether it is with mechanical means or actually physically, manually handling something, manually lifting and carrying something, we always want to think before we start. And that is taking the time out to figure out what dangers there are when it comes to lifting or lowering. So if you are lifting a load, if you are loading into your vehicles, offloading from your vehicles, all of this requires you to lift something. And either it is manually lifting with your own bodies, or perhaps you're going to be using something to lift with. Now, you could lift with forklifts, cranes, mobile elevated working platforms, pallet jacks, a block and tackle, or even the good old-fashioned leg and arms. Now, each one of these have their various advantages and disadvantages. For instance, it would be nice to carry a forklift around with you wherever you go, but they're super heavy and nobody has a flatbed or load truck that they can carry a forklift with them everywhere they go. Cranes are also very difficult to move around all the time, so it takes a long time to set them up. And if you think of things like overhead cranes inside factories, well, they're pretty much stuck in their position. And so all of these have their disadvantages. The advantages, though, is that you don't have to put too much strain on a person or more than one person trying to lift something that is too heavy for them. When it comes to mobile elevated working platforms, such as cherry pickers or scissors lifts, these are nice because they're mobile. You can get them delivered to site. They can lift or lower you or your equipment and tools. Obviously, everything has a safe working load, and so you cannot lift what the safe working load or the WLL is not allowed to lift. When it comes to pallet jacks, obviously that is limited to pallet jacks, block and tackle. There are many different types. Again, everything that you use, no matter what means you have, all have the same type of laws around them governing lifting and lowering. And so when it comes to the lifting machinery, we always look at driven machinery regulations. In fact, the entire legislation around occupational health and safety, looking just at the OHS Act, will tell us that any work that needs to be done must be done safely and without risk to employees' health or safety. And so when we look at that as a general clause or a general piece of legislation, any work must be done safely. We need to then look for the safest method of doing something. And so we might need to look at other pieces of legislation that govern the type of equipment we use. But when it comes to our own bodies, we might think, well, is there a piece of legislation that affects our legs and arms? Well, there actually is. This is called the ergonomics regulations. Now, ergonomics is making sure that the body is comfortable in performing its work. So we don't want to put any strain or sprains on our body, because that's going to cause either damage, injury right away, or it could cause long-term damage, obviously, in future by repetitive strain or repeatedly doing something that will cause strain later on. So when we're talking about lifting and lowering, we're looking at some of your major lifting failures. And we're going to just look at 5 things that cause lifting failures. And then we're going to look at each of these individually and how we can prevent it from actually happening. Now, the 5 things that can generally happen, which would cause failure when lifting or lowering, would be overloading or incorrectly using of any lifting gear. Now, again, this could be with any of those things mentioned earlier. It could be cranes, forklifts, cherry pickers, or even your own body. You could overload it or you could incorrectly use it, and that would cause a lifting failure. Then the insecure attachment of a load. Now, you might think, well, how can we insecurely attach a load if we're picking it up with our hand? Well, if you have too many things in your hand and you do not have a good grip on perhaps that box or those tools that you are carrying, then that is insecure attachment. Another insecure attachment would be not correctly rigging or slinging up that actual load. Then we take a look at improper methods or the improper use of the actual equipment as well. Failure of equipment. Failure of equipment due to non-maintenance. And maintenance schedules are very important in order to ensure that anything we use to lift is always kept in a good condition. This would include our own physical bodies, because if we do not maintain our bodies, we will not be fit enough to be able to lift something. Now, we're not saying that you need to run around the site and be able to lift 50 or 60 kgs at any given time. We know what the limits are, or the safe working limit. And within safety, we have a 20 to 25 safe working limit for any person to be able to lift something. So if it's more than 25 kgs, generally what we are going to put in our risk assessment is that you should have 2 people lifting that. Now, you might say to me, but Chris, that's half a bag of cement. I could lift a bag of cement on my own. There's nothing wrong with me lifting that. And why is that unsafe? Well, we're not saying it's unsafe. There are many of you that actually can lift a bag of cement on its own and carry it and move it from one place to the next. But repetitively doing that, or doing it more often than once, is putting a lot of strain on a person's body. And so what we decide is looking for the safest way of doing something, not reaching the limit. We don't ever want to get to the limit of something. We want to look at what the minimum is. And that is why we always have a safe factor. And that safety factor helps us then to identify what would be easy enough for a person to do over a longer period of time. And so that is why we might put these control measures in place through our risk assessments to be able to identify that somebody should only lift 20 kgs. So please understand the reason behind why these pieces of legislation are actually out. Then obviously the incorrect communication or incorrect signals given when doing any lifting or lowering can also cause huge lifting failures. So again, when we talk about any of these items, overloading, insecure attachments, improper methods, failure of equipment because of lack of maintenance or incorrect communication, all of this could actually be attributed to either one of those lifting areas, whether it is from a crane, forklift, or even our own bodies. Now, the first thing we want to look at is the overloading or incorrect use of lifting gear. Now, before starting any lift, we always need to check the safe working load of lifting gear against the weight to be lifted. Now, the safe working load is obviously what is the safety factor. We generally don't use safe working load all the time. We actually use what we call WLL or workload limit. But it's very common for a lot of people to still see and speak about safe working load. So the safe working load or the workload limit is normally always stamped on that piece of gear. So for chains, you will notice that it is always on the actual chain. It will always give you a workload limit of a certain amount of tonnage. Now, for our bodies, we don't necessarily have that printed on us. What is our safe working load, or what is our workload limit? If you look at the picture there on the right-hand side, you might say to yourself, he's strong enough to lift that. But is it on the limit? Is he already at capacity? In fact, if there were any shift in movement, if there was any additional weight put onto that person, the failure of that lift would definitely cause serious injury, not just to the person lifting it, but to the person on the ladder as well. And so this would definitely be one part of very incorrect use of the lifting equipment, the incorrect use of a ladder, and obviously a very dangerous situation. And situations like this that we see on site obviously is something that we would determine as a non-conformance. And when something like this happens, the person is obviously held responsible for acting in an unsafe manner. So when we talk about safe working loads or workload limit, we also want to remind you that this would be across the board of all lifting equipment, including our own bodies. So we must ensure that the equipment that we are using is fit for the intended purpose, because using an incorrect lifting gear, either overloading it or maybe using something that is not meant to be used as lifting equipment. So a forklift can lift a load, but a forklift cannot lift a load like a crane does. And a crane cannot lift a load like a forklift does, because they are two different types of loads. So we don't only want to look at the type of machinery being used, we also want to identify the type of load. And that is why it's very important for us to remember our safety aspects of stop, look, and then act. So before we do something, we want to first stop. We want to try and figure out what could go wrong. And this would be in terms of a risk assessment. This can be done documented. It can be done verbally. It could be done through a DSTI, a continual based risk assessment. What you want to achieve, though, is identifying where all those hazards are coming from, what the risk factor is, and then isolating specific control measures to prevent those hazards and risks from happening. And this is the meaning of safe. Safe literally means without risk. So can you maybe take a look at some of the tools and machinery that you are using, perhaps even our own bodies that we are using to lift or lower things? Are we doing it safely? So if you don't know them, here are a few acronyms of WLL, SWL, MBL, what they actually mean. Workload limit, that's the maximum load that a non-fitted lifting attachment is designed to lift under the conditions specified by the manufacturer. Then there's safe workload, formerly a common term, but today it is replaced by workload limit, as we mentioned. The MBL, or minimum braking load, indicates the minimum load or force to be achieved before the lifting equipment risks breakage or any change that causes the load to loosen. Then you've got normal capacity, which is used normally for cranes, hoists, and winches to indicate what they may safely lift. Then you have safety factor. That's how much stronger the equipment is compared to what it is designed to lift. The safety factor is generally a few extra tons on top of very big machines. For instance, if you have a forklift that can lift, let's say 200 kilograms, we will then have a safety factor of 20%. And so it can actually lift 240 kilograms, but you are never allowed to lift 240. So even though it can, we say you shouldn't. So even though a human body can lift, let's say 100 kgs, because that's what you're doing in the gym, it doesn't necessarily mean that we want you to lift 2 bags of cement while working. You see, that would be dangerous. It's not within a safety factor. And so we would take all of that into consideration and say the workload limit is not the limit of the actual lifting equipment. It is the lifting or workload limit that is the maximum load before the safety factor. So it can actually lift more. We would never limit or max out any lifting equipment, and that includes a human person. We never want you to max yourself out. Always give yourself a safety factor. And then proof load is the load burden that manufacturers have exposed the product to during testing. This is like a load test, when they would actually strain the machine out to see if that safety factor is still valid. So if a machine can lift 240, but it's only safe working load or workload limited at 200, they would then go and proof that load and see that it can still lift 240 kgs. And so we just need to understand that that is never done by ourselves. That is done by a competent person, maybe someone that's called an LMI, a lifting machine inspector. They would then test that machine and issue a certificate to say that it is still valid to be able to lift that load. Now, the incorrect attachment of a load. We just want to use the illustration of wiring or ropes that are generally used. Most ropes are designed with wire, strands, and cores. And this gives it its different safety factors or different load limits. Now, before using any wire rope or fiber slings, please make sure you inspect it. In fact, this goes across the board with any type of machine that we are using. Protect wire ropes, fiber slings from sharp edges. Never, ever lengthen a chain by joining pieces together. Rather get the correct piece of equipment that you need in order to do that load. Make sure that the chains are never twisted or kinked. Don't expose chains to acids or corrosive substances. This would go across the board with any lifting equipment attachment that you are using. And so when it comes to our own bodies, our hands, our feet, our legs, our back, all of that also needs to be protected. And this could be by either exposing it to the dangers of the actual type of load that we are lifting. You see, you could be lifting a box that is 25 kgs and the risk assessment says you can lift that safely. We might want to look at the type of box you are lifting. Is it awkward? Is it too long to carry? So even though the load is the right weight for you to lift it, is there an awkward positioning that we are going to put your body in where your arms are stretched out too far to be able to have correct attachment or to be able to grab onto the box correctly? Because if you're not correctly attached to that load, we might then say you should not be carrying it. So we don't only look at the load itself. We're not only looking at the weight, we are also looking at the attachment of that weight. So it's very important for us to know that the way we attach it or the center of gravity over that load makes a very big difference. So if you take a look at the picture now, if the hook is not over the center of gravity, the load will shift until the center of gravity is under the hook. And as soon as that will happen, it will make the entire load off balance. And what will normally happen here is it makes it very difficult to be able to place that load down. And now this is the same with any type of thing that you lift yourself. If it is awkward or uneven, then being able to lower your body down to place it down on the ground, even though it's not heavy, is still very dangerous because you are twisting or turning your body into a position that is not normal. The same can be true of slings and chains. If they start twisting and moving, not because of the actual load, but because of the awkward placement of the load or the insecure attachment of the load, this could end up damaging the actual lifting equipment. So again, even though it is workload limited to 1 ton and you are only lifting 100 kgs, if it is not being lifted correctly, you could also damage the machine. So just because it says 1 ton, it does not necessarily mean that no matter what you do, how many kgs up to a ton that you lifted, it should lift it fine. There are so many other factors that are involved in lifting and lowering any type of load. So make sure that the ropes and slings are not stored in wet conditions. Use the right type of shackles. Don't use any shackles that aren't marked with your safe working load or your working load limit. Check the bow and the pin for damage. Basically, we want to inspect and check that any part of the machinery, tools, equipment that we are using to lift or lower is in good, safe condition. So we always want to check for cracks, cuts, abrasions, dents. And if we are in doubt, doubt means we just have a feeling it's not working properly and it's not running properly. We're not too sure. Just either send it in to go and get tested or do not use that piece of equipment. So when it comes to the improper use of equipment, that is also very possible. Because it's called lifting equipment, we often feel, well, it can lift anything. But as we mentioned earlier, a crane cannot do everything that a forklift can do, and a forklift cannot do everything that a crane can do. There might be overlapping things that it can do, but they are not designed for the same purpose. They are designed for lifting specific loads. So if it is not used correctly, lifting equipment and the activities resulting on lifting equipment can cause serious injury or even death. So what do we need to do again? Stop, think, and then act on what you see. This will help you to identify if you are using the right type of lifting tool, the right methods for lifting, as well as the right attachments for actually lifting. And then never do this, which is something that we always do. Make a plan. Never try to just quickly lift a load because waiting for the right equipment would take too long. You see, we've got something that can lift, so let's just quickly do it. And then when that piece of equipment arrives, we can do the rest of it. You know, we've got 5 loads to lift. We can quickly make a plan with one of the loads just to get some work done. That generally ends up in serious injuries or accidents. Now we move over to, again, using improper methods. Well, this would go across the board with cranes, forklifts, and again, a human person. So if you are, as a plumber, lifting any type of equipment, maybe carrying it up or downstairs, perhaps you've got all of your fixtures in a box that you need to carry to the working area to do your installation of plumbing, we want you to adhere to these very basic, simple rules. If you're lifting boxes or any loads, ensure that you lift it with your legs and not your back. Keep the load as close to your waist as possible, as close to your body as possible. Always have a very stable position when lifting or carrying a load. Ensure that you have a good hold on the load. So that insecure attachment, we want you to be able to have a secure attachment to that load. Do not bend your back when lifting. All right, keep it straight and always lift with your legs. Do not bend the back any further while lifting. So don't bend it while lifting, and then don't bend it while carrying that load. If it is too heavy, find somebody else to assist you. And then try not to twist when you lift it. See, as soon as you twist, you're putting a lot of strain on your back. You're putting a lot of strain on your hips. All of that is obviously connected on your spine, your musculoskeletal system, and that could cause damage from your neck all the way down to your feet. So improper methods of lifting cause serious injury to a person. They cause serious damage to tools and equipment. We never want to become someone who cannot walk properly, somebody who is bound to a wheelchair, or perhaps even someone that becomes permanently disabled, that we can never walk again purely because we incorrectly used our bodies to lift something. So we were always told to plan for the safest way to perform a task. We say that all the time in all of our toolbox talks. Work at what is safe. Look at your safe working limit. Make sure the area around you is safe. And at times, we have noticed that people choose to work in unsafe conditions because they feel that accidents don't happen to them. They normally say accidents happen to the other person. So we see pictures like this. We see unsafe conditions. We share them across social media. And actually what we're saying to ourselves is, look at this person. Why are they doing this? And yet when we find ourselves in a similar position, it's because we just quickly want to get something done. Now, when we have this type of outlook or viewpoint, we can put ourselves in serious danger situations that could possibly cause the loss of our life or potentially the cost of life of someone else. So ask yourself, how would you feel if you caused the death of someone else because you engaged in something that was unsafe. None of us want to be in that situation. Now, the lack of maintenance is also a very big factor in why tools and equipment or any lifting machinery fails to lift a load or lower a load. So all lifting tackle must be examined at intervals not exceeding 3 months. So all lifting tackle must be examined at intervals not exceeding 3 months. This includes wire ropes, chains, hooks, or anything like that on any lifting machinery. The lifting machinery must also be examined at intervals not exceeding 6 months. This examination is a full, thorough one, and then the lifting machine must be subjected to an annual performance. This is a load test as it is prescribed in the driven machinery regulations. Now, to end off, we want to look at incorrect communication. Incorrect communication of lifting and lowering also cause the failure of lifting. Signals must be clear and, where possible, barehanded. If you do have gloves on, make sure the gloves are nice and tight fitting so the person can actually see your hands. And obviously your fingers have a lot to do with the type of signaling that you do. The load must never be directed so that it passes over any person. Operators should not make a move until they receive and understand the signal from the signal person. If contact between the signal person and the operator is broken for any reason, the entire operation must stop. You cannot continue any operation of lifting or lowering unless you have clear lines of communication, because incorrect or improper communication will end up in a failure of that lift. Now, while only one person is generally a trained signal person, any person or anyone can give the stop signal, and the operator must obey it immediately. That is because something could be wrong, and just because it's the signal person's responsibility to adequately move the load, any person can stop that load in case of an emergency. Now, some situations do call for two signalers. For instance, during a concrete pour, one signaler may be needed to direct the lift while the other one directs the drop. In this case, please ensure you have procedures in place for how to lift, how to signal, and what is the correct methodology. Now, where a difficult lift demands voice communication, please use two-way radios instead of hand signals. This would be required because it is a difficult lift. So, lifting and lowering techniques, from lifting machinery to our actual bodies, please ensure that it is safe and without risk to you and any person around you. So we want to say thank you very much for joining us this morning. Don't forget your safety thought for this week. Lift smart. So stop and think, then start.